Amidst the calm of a rainy evening, Olivia Renshaw sipped her tea by the kitchen window. The faint sound of thunder echoed in the distance when an eerie glow illuminated the night sky. Her eyes widened as she spotted a massive, silent UFO hovering just beyond the treetops. What came next defied all logic. The lights flickered, time seemed to warp, and an unexplainable terror consumed her. Olivia's life was about to spiral into a chilling nightmare that would leave you breathless. Olivia Renshaw cherished the calm of her Vermont home, nestled in dense woods and rolling hills. Her life was peaceful, filled with routines that grounded her. But one rainy evening, her reality unraveled in ways she could never have anticipated. The storm began gently, a soft drizzle tapping against her kitchen window as she brewed a cup of chamomile tea. The rhythm of the rain and the faint whistle of her kettle created a soothing melody. Olivia stood by the counter, lost in thought. The storm outside didn't bother her. In fact, it was the kind of weather she enjoyed most. She liked the way the rain softened the world, washing it clean. But that night, the rain carried with it something more sinister. As she stirred honey into her tea, a faint light caught her attention. She paused, spoon in hand, and turned toward the window. Beyond the yard, past the oak tree that marked the edge of her property, a glow hovered in the distance. At first, she dismissed it as a trick of the storm, perhaps lightning reflecting strangely in the clouds. But as she looked closer, she realized the glow wasn't natural. It pulsed, steady and hypnotic, like a heartbeat. Her pulse quickened. She leaned closer to the window, her breath fogging the glass. The light seemed to float just above the treetops, moving in slow, deliberate patterns. It wasn't lightning. It wasn't a plane. Rational thoughts urged her to dismiss it as a drone or something equally mundane. But deep down, Olivia felt certain it was neither. The object hovered silently, impossibly large and motionless against the night sky. No hum of machinery, no sound of engines. Just an oppressive, eerie silence that may. Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone, desperate to capture what she was seeing. If she could just take a picture or a video, she could prove to herself that this was real. But as she fumbled with the device, the lights in her house flickered. The phone's screen went black, and the faint hum of the refrigerator died, leaving the house eerily quiet. She gasped, her eyes darting back to the window. The object outside was descending now, its glow growing brighter, illuminating her yard in an otherworldly light. Shadows stretched unnaturally across her kitchen walls, twisting and contorting as the beam swept over her garden. It lingered there as though it were searching for something, or someone. Olivia's chest tightened. She tried to scream, to move, but her body refused. She felt paralyzed, rooted to the spot by a force she couldn't see or understand. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the light retracted. The object began to ascend, its glow dimming until it disappeared into the clouds above. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The storm had stopped. The rain was no longer pounding against the windows. It had softened to a faint drizzle. Olivia stood frozen, staring at the empty yard. Her mind raced, replaying the events, searching for logic where there was none. Minutes passed before she moved. Her knees felt weak, and she collapsed into a chair, clutching the edge of the table for support. The encounter had lasted mere moments, but it felt like an eternity. Her heart pounded in her chest, her hands trembling as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. Could she have imagined it? Was it possible for her mind to conjure something so vivid, so terrifying? That night, Olivia locked every door and window, her paranoia growing with every creak of the house. She clutched her phone like a lifeline, though it remained lifeless in her hands. Sleep, when it finally came, offered no relief. Her dreams were vivid and horrifying. A cold metallic room, harsh lights and shadowy figures that loomed over her. Their faces were obscured, but their eyes, silver and unblinking, pierced through her. She woke several times during the night, gasping for air, her chest tight. When morning came, Olivia forced herself to move. She needed coffee, something to steady her nerves. But as she approached the window, a chill ran down her spine. The grass outside was scorched in a perfect circle, its edges crisp and blackened. Her garden, once lush and vibrant, was now barren. The air around the spot felt heavier, charged with an energy she couldn't describe. She stared at the damage, her hands trembling as the realization struck. This was no hallucination. Her first instinct was to call someone, anyone, but who would believe her? Even to her, the story sounded insane. Instead, she grabbed a notebook and began to write. Her hand shook as she detailed every moment she could recall. The light, the object, the beam, and the paralyzing terror. Writing helped, if only a little. But no matter how much she wrote, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Days passed in a haze. Olivia went through her routine on autopilot, but her mind was elsewhere. At night, she noticed lights in the distance, the ones she had always dismissed as stars or planes, moving in deliberate patterns. They weren't just lights. They felt alive, their movements calculated. Each time she saw them, her breath caught in her throat. Her dreams grew worse. She saw herself strapped to a table surrounded by beings with glowing eyes. Their voices, sharp and alien, echoed in her ears, though she couldn't understand their words. She woke each time drenched in sweat, her heart racing. One evening, standing by her window, she finally understood. The lights weren't random. They were watching her. Patterns emerged, forming shapes she couldn't comprehend but instinctively feared. Whatever had visited her that night hadn't left. It was still out there, watching, waiting. Her quiet life was gone. Deep down, she knew this was only the beginning of something far darker. Her home, once her refuge, now felt like a cage. Olivia Renshaw awoke the next morning feeling groggy, her head pounding as if she had been awake all night. Sunlight streamed through her curtains, but something about the brightness felt wrong. She reached for her phone on the nightstand, only to remember that it had shut off the previous night. She sighed, forcing herself out of bed. The events of the night before played in her mind on a loop, vivid and terrifying. In the kitchen, she glanced at the clock. It read 10:23 a.m. Panic shot through her. She always woke at 7 a.m. sharp. Her internal clock was impeccable. What had happened to the last 3 hours? She tried to recall waking during the night, but her memory was hazy. There were flashes, fragments of scenes she couldn't piece together. Bright lights, a cold sensation, a muffled voice. Her stomach churned as she realized she couldn't remember falling asleep. She stepped outside to clear her head, her bare feet sinking into the cool, wet grass. Her eyes fell on the scorched circle in her yard. The sight was a stark reminder that last night hadn't been a bad dream. The air around the circle felt heavy, charged. She hesitated before stepping closer, half expecting the beam of light to return. The smell of burned earth stung her nose, and she had the distinct feeling she was trespassing on ground that didn't belong to her. Her neighbor, Margaret, waved at her from the fence line. Olivia froze. How could she explain this? The burn marks? The fact that her garden looked like it had been scorched by something not of this world? She waved back weakly, retreating into the house before Margaret could approach. Her heart raced as she locked the door behind her. Inside, she brewed a fresh pot of coffee, the bitter aroma helping to ground her. She tried to focus on mundane tasks, watering her houseplants, folding laundry, but her mind refused to stay calm. Every sound, every creak of the house made her jump. She checked her phone, praying it had somehow come back to life. When it didn't, she plugged it into the charger. The screen remained black. By early afternoon, Olivia felt an inexplicable exhaustion wash over her. It was the kind of fatigue that no amount of caffeine could fix. She sank into her couch, intending to rest her eyes for just a moment. When she woke, it was dark. The clock read 7:14 p.m. 7 hours had passed. Panic gripped her as she realized she couldn't remember lying down, much less falling asleep. What was happening? Her reflection in the bathroom mirror startled her. Dark circles framed her eyes and her skin looked pallid, almost translucent. As she splashed water on her face, she noticed something unusual on her wrist. A mark. It was faint, almost like a scar, shaped like a perfect circle with jagged edges. She ran her fingers over it, but it didn't hurt. It wasn't there yesterday. She was sure of it. Her heart sank as dread took hold. Was this connected to last night? Desperate for answers, she powered up her laptop and began searching for anything that might explain the mark. Her initial searches, burns, rashes, insect bites, yielded nothing helpful. But then she stumbled upon a forum for UFO sightings. She hesitated, her fingers hovering over the trackpad. Was she really about to dive into this rabbit hole? But curiosity and fear won out. The posts she found were both reassuring and terrifying. Dozens of people described experiences eerily similar to her own. Bright lights, missing time, strange marks. Some users claimed they had been chosen, though for what, no one seemed to know. Others spoke of recurring nightmares and feelings of being watched. The more she read, the more her anxiety grew. It felt like these people were describing her life. A soft knock on her front door startled her. She froze, her laptop slipping from her lap. No one ever knocked on her door unannounced. Her nearest neighbors, Margaret and Bill, would always call first. Her pulse quickened as the knock came again, louder this time. She tiptoed to the window, careful to stay hidden behind the curtains. A black car sat idling on the street, its windows tinted so dark she couldn't see inside. Her heart raced. She wanted to believe it was just someone lost, maybe a salesman, but the car's presence felt wrong, invasive. The knock came a third time, followed by a voice. "Miss Renshaw." It was a man's voice, calm and polite, but it sent chills down her spine. She didn't move. She didn't breathe. Minutes passed, and when she finally peeked through the window again, the car was gone. That night her dreams were worse than ever. The cold metallic room returned, but this time it felt real. Too real. She could hear the hum of machinery, feel the chill of the table beneath her. Shadowy figures moved around her, their features indistinct, as if hidden by a fog. She tried to scream, but her voice wouldn't come. The dream ended with her bolting upright in bed, her chest heaving, the faint imprint of the circular mark glowing on her wrist. The following morning, Olivia decided she couldn't face this alone. She posted anonymously on the UFO forum, describing her experience in as much detail as she dared. Within minutes, replies flooded in. Some were kind, offering advice or support. Others were frantic, warning her to stay quiet, to trust no one. One message stood out among the rest. "They'll come back. They always do." Olivia Renshaw's life was unraveling, and the mark on her wrist had become the focal point of her growing paranoia. Each day that passed, she found herself drawn to it, unable to ignore its strange, almost unnatural presence. It glowed faintly in the dark, a subtle pulse she could feel more than see. At times it felt warm, as though it were alive. It was a constant reminder of the night that had torn her life apart. She spent hours on the UFO forum, scrolling through posts from strangers who described eerily similar marks. Some claimed the marks faded over time, while others insisted they became permanent, a brand of sorts. A few warned of more sinister consequences: tracking, control, and even abduction. Olivia's chest tightened as she considered the possibility. Was she being watched? Had the mark turned her into some kind of target? Her days became a blur of fear and obsession. She barely ate, barely slept. When she did manage to close her eyes, the nightmares returned, darker and more vivid than ever. The metallic room was now more detailed. She could see its cold steel walls, hear the faint hum of machinery, and feel icy restraints on her wrists and ankles. The shadowy figures were no longer obscured. Their elongated faces and piercing, unblinking eyes haunted her. She always woke gasping for air, her wrist burning as if the mark were alive. One morning, as Olivia sipped a forgotten cup of coffee, she noticed something strange. The mark on her wrist was changing. The jagged edges seemed sharper, more defined, and the faint glow was now brighter. She could swear she heard a faint hum emanating from it, like a low-frequency vibration that reverberated through her bones. Panic set in. She grabbed a scarf and wrapped it tightly around her wrist, desperate to hide it from view, even from herself. That evening, Olivia received an email from someone who had seen her anonymous post on the forum. The subject line read, "You're not alone." She hesitated before opening it, her finger hovering over the mouse. When she finally clicked, the message was brief but chilling. "I know what's happening to you. If you want answers, meet me at Gray Hollow Diner tomorrow at 9 p.m. Don't tell anyone. CV." Her heart raced. Who was this person? Could she trust them? Was this a trap? But as much as she feared it, the possibility of answers was irresistible. The next night, Olivia arrived at the diner just before 9 p.m. The place was nearly empty, its neon sign buzzing faintly in the cold night air. She scanned the room nervously until her eyes landed on a man sitting in the corner booth. He looked to be in his late 30s, disheveled and gaunt, with tired eyes that darted toward her the moment she stepped inside. He nodded, motioning for her to sit. "Olivia," he said, his voice low and hurried. "I'm Caleb Voss. I saw your post. I know what you're going through because it happened to me, too." She stared at him, her throat dry. His wrist was wrapped in a bandage, but when he noticed her looking, he unwrapped it, revealing a mark identical to hers. "This," he said, gesturing to the mark, "isn't random. They choose us for a reason." She leaned in, her voice trembling. "Who are they? Why me?" Caleb hesitated, glancing around the diner as if expecting someone to burst in at any moment. "They're not human," he said finally, "and they're not from here. The mark, it's a link, a connection to them. It allows them to track us, maybe even control us." He paused, his expression grim. "The mark isn't just a scar. It's a signal." Olivia felt the blood drain from her face. A signal for what? Caleb hesitated, then said, "For them to come back." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Olivia's mind raced. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but her voice failed her. Caleb leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I've been living with this for 10 years. They visit me in my dreams, just like they're visiting you. But dreams aren't all they can do. If the mark activates, they can reach you, even when you're awake." The room seemed to tilt. Olivia gripped the edge of the table, struggling to steady herself. "How do I stop it?" she whispered. Caleb shook his head. "I don't know if you can, but there are ways to slow it down. Stay away from electronics. The mark reacts to them. And whatever you do, don't let them isolate you. They feed on fear." Olivia's heart pounded. Every instinct told her to run, but her legs felt like lead. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Because they don't stop," Caleb said, his expression dark. "Once you're marked, they don't stop until they get what they want." Before Olivia could respond, the lights in the diner flickered. Caleb froze, his eyes darting to the windows. "They're here," he muttered, his voice shaking. "You need to leave. Now." "What about you?" Olivia asked, her voice trembling. "I'll distract them," he said, already standing. "But you have to go. Don't let them find you." She didn't need to be told twice. Grabbing her coat, she bolted from the diner, the cold night air biting at her skin. Behind her, she heard a low, rumbling hum that seemed to vibrate through the ground. She didn't look back. When she finally made it home, she locked every door and window, her chest heaving. The mark on her wrist burned, brighter than ever. She collapsed onto the floor, tears streaming down her face. For the first time, she realized there was no escaping this. They were coming for her. Olivia Renshaw hadn't left her house in 3 days. She kept the curtains drawn, the doors locked, and the lights off. Every noise outside made her jump, a snapping branch, the rustle of leaves, the hum of a passing car. Her paranoia grew like a storm she couldn't escape. The mark on her wrist pulsed faintly, its glow visible beneath the scarf she kept wrapped around it. The pulse was constant now, like a second heartbeat she couldn't silence. Caleb's words haunted her. Once you're marked, they don't stop. She couldn't stop replaying the moment in the diner when the lights flickered, when Caleb had whispered, "They're here." What had happened to him after she left? She wanted to find out if he was okay but had no way to reach him. Her phone, still lifeless, sat on the table. She had tried everything, charging it, restarting it, but nothing worked. It was as if the device had been permanently disabled the night of the encounter. Caleb's warning about electronics echoed in her mind. The mark reacts to them. On the fourth night, the nightmares returned. She was in the metallic room again, strapped to the cold table. The shadowy figures loomed over her, their unblinking eyes boring into her soul. One reached out, its elongated fingers brushing the mark on her wrist. The pain was unbearable, like fire coursing through her veins. She woke up screaming, clutching her wrist as the mark glowed brighter than before. She stumbled into the bathroom, splashing cold water on her face, trying to steady her breathing. When she looked in the mirror, her reflection startled her. She looked gaunt, her cheeks hollow, her eyes sunken. She pulled the scarf off her wrist and stared at the mark. It wasn't just glowing, it was moving. The jagged edges shifted, pulsating in a rhythm that seemed to sync with her heartbeat. Desperate for answers, she retrieved her laptop and powered it on. The screen flickered to life, and for a moment, she hesitated. Then she opened the browser and returned to the UFO forum. She scrolled through posts, searching for anything that might help her. Most of the threads were the same, stories of lights, marks, nightmares. But one post caught her attention. The signal, what it means, and what happens next. Her hands trembled as she clicked on the thread. The original poster claimed to be an expert on the phenomenon. Their words sent chills down her spine. The signal is a beacon. Once activated, it broadcasts your location to them. The mark isn't just a scar, it's a receiver. The rest of the thread was filled with frantic comments from others who claimed to be marked. Some spoke of being followed, of shadowy presences moving through their rooms at night. Others warned of the Watchers, beings who came before the final encounter, silent and cloaked in darkness. Olivia's stomach churned. She closed the laptop and shoved it under the couch as if hiding it would make the information disappear. But the words stayed with her. A receiver. A beacon. They were tracking her. Watching her. Waiting. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat in the living room clutching a kitchen knife, her eyes darting to the windows at every sound. The silence felt oppressive. The mark on her wrist burned, the glow pulsing steadily. She checked the clock. It was 3:14 a.m. And then she heard it. A low, mechanical hum, faint but unmistakable. It vibrated through the walls, setting her teeth on edge. She froze, her grip tightening on the knife. The hum grew louder. She crawled to the window, keeping low, and peeked through the curtain. A dark figure stood at the edge of her yard. Her breath caught in her throat. The figure was tall, unnaturally so, with a slender frame and elongated limbs. It didn't move, didn't flinch, even as the wind whipped through the trees. Its face, or what she thought was its face, was obscured, shrouded in shadow, but she could feel its gaze, its unrelenting focus on her. The hum intensified. She backed away from the window, her hands shaking. The knife slipped from her grasp, clattering to the floor. She scrambled to her feet, her mind racing. Caleb's words echoed in her mind. The Watchers come first. She ran to the back door, fumbling with the lock, and stepped outside into the freezing night air. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she scanned the yard. The figure was gone. The hum had stopped, replaced by an eerie stillness. She turned to go back inside, but then she saw it. Another figure standing at the tree line. And another. And another. They were surrounding her. Her pulse raced as she backed toward the house. The figures didn't move, but their presence was overwhelming. She stumbled inside, slamming the door behind her and locking it. She collapsed onto the floor, tears streaming down her face. The mark on her wrist burned hotter than ever, its glow illuminating the dark room. For the rest of the night, she sat curled up in the corner, clutching the knife, her eyes fixed on the windows. She didn't sleep. She didn't dare move. When dawn finally broke, the figures were gone. But the mark remained, a constant reminder that they were still watching, still waiting. Olivia barely survived the night. Every sound, every shadow seemed like a threat. The figures had vanished with the first rays of sunlight, but their presence lingered in her mind. Her house felt violated, her sense of safety shattered. She spent the morning trying to calm herself, sipping tea she could barely taste, her hand trembling so much she spilled it across the table. The mark on her wrist still burned, its glow faint but unyielding, as if mocking her. She sat on the couch, staring at the blank TV screen, unwilling to turn it on. The thought of electronics made her uneasy. Caleb's warning still echoed in her mind. The mark reacts to them. She glanced at the window, its curtains pulled tightly shut. The sunlight outside felt like a thin shield between her and the horrors of the previous night. As the hours dragged on, Olivia's anxiety grew. The hum she'd heard haunted her. It wasn't just a sound, it had been a presence, something alive, something otherworldly. She reached for her laptop, the one piece of technology she hadn't discarded. Taking a deep breath, she powered it on. The UFO forum greeted her, its threads a mix of warnings and bizarre theories. One new post caught her attention. The title read, "They don't leave empty-handed." She hesitated before clicking. The user, anonymous like the rest, had written only a single sentence. "If you've been marked, it's not a question of if, they will come back." Her stomach churned. She closed the laptop, her pulse racing. She couldn't sit idly and wait. She had to act, to find answers. But who could she turn to? Caleb had been her only link to this nightmare, and she hadn't heard from him since the diner. The thought of what might have happened to him made her shudder. By mid-afternoon, desperation pushed her out of the house. She wrapped her wrist with a scarf, threw on a coat, and drove to the only place she could think of, the diner. The streets were eerily quiet, the winter chill biting at her skin as she parked. The neon sign buzzed faintly. Inside, the diner was almost empty save for a waitress wiping the counter. Olivia hesitated before approaching her. "Excuse me," she said, her voice trembling. "The man I met here a few nights ago, Caleb Voss. Do you know him?" The waitress frowned, shaking her head. "We don't get many people here late at night, miss. Are you sure you've got the right place?" "I'm sure," Olivia insisted. "He was sitting in that booth." She pointed to the corner where Caleb had sat. The waitress followed her gaze, uneasy. "No one's sat there in weeks," she said softly. "Are you feeling okay?" Olivia felt her knees weaken. She turned and stumbled out of the diner, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Caleb was real. She knew he was. She could still hear his voice, his warnings. But now, doubt began to creep in. Had the mark been playing tricks on her mind? That evening, back at home, the hum returned. It started faint, a low vibration rattling through her chest. She froze, clutching the knife she'd left on the coffee table. The hum grew louder, filling the air. The mark on her wrist burned hotter than ever, its glow illuminating the room. Olivia scrambled to her feet, her heart racing. She peered through the curtains and her blood ran cold. The figures were back. They stood motionless at the edge of her yard, their elongated bodies silhouetted against the pale moonlight. But this time, there were more of them. Dozens. Hundreds. Her pulse thundered as she backed away from the window. The knife felt useless in her hand, a mere trinket against the overwhelming presence outside. The hum grew deafening, a sound so deep it seemed to burrow into her mind. And then, they moved. The figures didn't walk. They glided, their movements unnaturally smooth. Olivia stumbled backward, falling as the first figure reached her porch. Its hand, long, skeletal, impossibly black, pressed against the window. The glass didn't crack, but the air rippled, distorting the room like a heat wave. "No," Olivia whispered, tears streaming. "Please, no." The mark on her wrist pulsed violently, its glow matching the hum's rhythm. She clutched it, trying to stop the sensation, but it only intensified. Pain shot through her arm, up her shoulder, and into her chest. She screamed, the sound lost beneath the deafening hum. And then, silence. The hum stopped. The figures vanished. Olivia lay trembling on the floor, her mind spinning. The mark on her wrist was still glowing, but the pain had dulled to an ache. She pushed herself up, her legs weak, and stumbled to the window. The yard was empty. The night was still. She collapsed onto the couch, her heart pounding. Had it been real? Had they been here? Her mind felt fractured, unable to process what had happened. She glanced at her wrist and froze. The mark had changed. Its jagged edges were now sharp, and in its center was a new detail. A glowing dot. A signal. Her laptop pinged from across the room. It was the first time it had made a sound in days. She crawled to it, shaking, and flipped it open. A single message blinked on the screen. "They're not done yet." Olivia stared at the glowing message on her laptop screen. "They're not done yet." Her hands trembled as she slammed the laptop shut, pushing it away as though the words might leap out at her. The room felt colder, darker, despite the lamp she'd turned on moments ago. The mark on her wrist continued to glow faintly, the dot in its center pulsing like a heartbeat. She paced the room, her thoughts racing. What did they want? Why hadn't they taken her already? Every encounter with the figures felt like a warning she couldn't decipher. Caleb's cryptic words echoed in her mind, but she now doubted he'd told her everything. Or had they silenced him before he could? Her chest tightened. She couldn't stay here any longer. The house felt like a prison, its walls closing in. Grabbing her keys, she shoved on her coat and bolted for the door. The icy night air stung her face, but she welcomed the sharpness. It made her feel alive. She climbed into her car, the engine sputtering to life as she pulled out of the driveway. The streets were eerily quiet. Streetlights flickered as she passed, casting long shadows across the pavement. The radio buzzed faintly with static, though she hadn't turned it on. She tried not to glance at her wrist, but the glow was impossible to ignore. She didn't know where she was going, just away. But as she reached the edge of town, the air changed. The atmosphere thickened, pressing against her chest. The engine stuttered, headlights dimming. She gripped the wheel tighter. "No, no, no," she muttered, pressing the gas harder. The car jerked forward, then died completely. The radio's static cut out as silence engulfed her. Panic set in. Olivia fumbled with the keys, but the ignition wouldn't turn. She glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. Figures emerged from the tree line, tall and dark, their movements slow but deliberate. She threw open the door and ran. Her legs felt heavy, her breath visible in the icy air. The road stretched endlessly ahead, the trees on either side whispering as the wind passed through. The figures didn't falter. They glided effortlessly, gaining on her despite her sprinting. Her lungs burned, but she pushed on. Ahead, a faint light appeared. A cabin. She veered off the road, stumbling toward it. The light grew brighter until she reached the door, pounding on it with all her strength. "Please," she cried, "let me in." The door creaked open, revealing an older man with wary eyes. He hesitated, then motioned her inside. Quickly. She stumbled into the cabin, collapsing onto the wooden floor. The man bolted the door behind her. "You shouldn't have come here," he muttered. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice shaking. "I had nowhere else to go." The man didn't answer. Instead, he rolled up his sleeve, revealing a mark identical to hers. Her stomach dropped. "They've been watching me for years," he said. "Now they've found you. They won't stop." The cabin shook as the hum returned, louder than before. Olivia clutched her wrist, the mark burning brighter than ever. "What do they want?" she asked, tears streaming down her face. "To finish what they started," the man said grimly. The windows shattered as blinding light flooded the room. Olivia screamed, the pain from her wrist spreading through her entire body. The last thing she heard before the light consumed her was the man's voice, shouting, "Fight it! Don't let them!" When she opened her eyes, she was back in the metallic room, strapped to the cold table. The shadowy figures surrounded her, their unblinking eyes piercing into her soul. One leaned closer, its elongated hand hovering above her forehead. A voice echoed in her mind, cold and detached. "You belong to us now." As the light engulfed her once more, Olivia realized there was no escape.